Welcome to Beyond the Game, where mental wellness competes. I'm your host, Philip Reynolds, licensed clinical social worker, LCSW. I spent over 2 decades working in mental and behavioral health, sitting with families, athletes, and young people in some of the hardest moments of their lives. Over time, one pattern became impossible to ignore. The athletes who looked the strongest on the outside were often carrying the heaviest pressure on the inside. I kept meeting high performers who knew how to train their bodies, knew how to push through pain, knew how to fight for a starting spot or a scholarship, but no one had ever taught them how to process loss, identity shifts, injury, burnout, or the silence that comes when their playing careers end. That gap is what led me to create Copious Life Sports Initiative, or CLSI. Our mission is to close what we call the resilience gap. That is the space between pushing through and breaking down, where too many athletes get stranded. This podcast exists because the conversation around athlete mental health needs more than headlines. It needs stories, real stories from athletes who lived it, coaches who saw it, parents who felt it, journalists who covered it, professionals working to change the system. Because athletes are not just performers, they're people. Here, we talk about the pressure behind the performance, the identity behind the jersey, the silence behind the success. My hope is that every episode helps athletes feel less alone, helps families feel more equipped, helps coaches and leaders rethink what it really means to support the whole athlete. This is Beyond the Game, and I'm really glad you're here.
Excited to have with us today our guest, Grant H. Paulsen, one of the most recognizable voices on DC sports media, a veteran journalist, TV analyst, and co-host of popular Grant and Danny show on 106.7 The Fan. A lifelong storyteller, Grant has covered sports at every level from national spring training to NFL locker rooms and has appeared on NBC Sports Washington, MLB Network, and NFL Network. Known for his sharp analysis and unmatched work ethic, Grant also brings something rare to the mic: vulnerability. He's spoken candidly about his own battle with anxiety and pressures of getting the story right in a world that never stops watching. Grant's insights don't just come from the sidelines, it comes from the heart of the arena. Whether he's covering rising stars or calling out the culture, Grant understands the weight of performance, the grind behind the headlines, and the human side of sports. Thank you for joining us, Grant. How are you today?
My pleasure. Thank you, Philip. What's going on, man?
We are working to bring light to mental health in the sports ecosystem and decided, who better to kind of tell that story from the other side and those invisible areas that we don't get to see than someone such as yourself. I'm a huge fan, longtime listener, so really excited to have you on today. And so we're going to first start with you, the child prodigy media guy. So your early journalism career, rising in the DC sports media, public facing, the pressures that come with that, the on-air demands. Talk to me a little bit about Grant and tell me kind of your story.
Yeah, I was really lucky at a very young age to have known what I wanted to do and what I was passionate about, first of all. And then I had a very supportive family and parents specifically who helped me to get really neat opportunities at a really young age. So I was fortunate enough, starting really around the age of 10 years old, to start to participate in coverage of sports in the media sphere. It all kind of began because my uncle was a very, very popular radio personality in Pittsburgh, not in a sports way in any capacity really, but he was a morning disc jockey, I would call it. He was a music rock station host on a station called WDV in Pittsburgh for many years. He had the most popular show in the city and almost maybe like for DC people like an Elliot in the Morning kind of show. Well, long story short, he was my godfather and I was close with him. And as I got to be, 10 years old, 9 years old, we started to talk trash and sports all the time. Big Pittsburgh fan, Penguins, Steelers, whatever. And so, we get into it at like a family picnic or whatever in the summer one year about me talking about this Redskins game at the time. It was a scrimmage they'd have every year with the Steelers, not even a preseason game, but like a legit scrimmage in training camp. And I knew all the stats and like, oh, well, they had beaten the Steelers 14-7 and this quarterback did this or whatever. And now I get it because I'm on the radio every day. But like he was thinking about this as he's listening to me like a radio bit. Because I'm a 10-year-old who's like obsessed with sports and has all these stats memorized.
Right.
So he brought me onto his show to do football picks as his sports bookie at a time where there was no legal gambling, there was no FanDuel, DraftKings, all that stuff. As literally a bit, like my bookie is my 10-year-old nephew.
Right.
Here he is.
Right.
Let's, give me. So I would give him the betting line of every game, and then my pick for the game. And a couple of years, did okay. And so from that is kind of how that all started. So then the local newspaper in my county in King George, Virginia, wrote a story about this. Like, hey, this local kid in 5th grade here is doing these call-ins on the radio and picking football games. They started asking me to write a very, very small column. I'll use air quotes. It was a couple paragraph thought on the DC sports landscape. And I did that in the local once a week King George Journal. From there, Channel 9 out of Washington did a story, and they basically come down and film me at school, and they say, hey, get a load of this. This kid does these picks on the radio and writes this column. And then Channel 9 did this interview with me, and then they had me do football picks on Fridays on their sportscasts in the 1999 season. That's kind of the time frame we're working at, right around the turn of the millennium. And so from there, other things led on. The Letterman show, they have me on the Letterman show as a kind of just a fast-talking sports kid. You see people on like Ellen's couch or Letterman talking about, knowing everything about all the presidents or every bone in the human body or whatever. It's like a human interest kid thing. I was just a kid that knew a lot about sports. And so that's kind of how it all started, honestly. That was the opportunity. And from age 10 to age roughly 16 or 17, and my kind of formative childhood years into middle school, high school, I would write stories in the newspaper and I would do phoners to radio shows. And I had my own radio show on Sirius XM on a kids and teen talk station. And that was kind of the genesis of everything. And I give a lot of credit to my father, who would have to transport me around and give up weekends and boating and all this stuff that he liked to do, and would contact people on my behalf to get me opportunities occasionally. And, eventually, I grew facial hair and I wasn't as cute anymore and it wasn't as funny anymore. And so then the phone stopped ringing and I was, in high school, and then eventually went to college at George Mason. I was still working the whole time at Sirius XM doing my own shows, doing some other things, but very much less profile. I wasn't on Letterman or Real Sports and Brian Gumbel anymore, any of those types of things. That all went away. But I was, I was working. I was sleeping on the floor of radio stations and running the board and, doing the kind of grind stuff that you normally have to do while simultaneously still having some ins and some contacts and working those as best I could. And then what I would say, like I kind of relaunched the second phase of my career, very end of my time at Mason, going into my final year of school. I was able to become an assistant beat reporter at 106.7 The Fan, which is essentially like an hourly paid, like intern type job. And I helped Chris Russell be who was the beat reporter. And so I did that and did some nighttime and weekend, co-hosting, filling in, whatever they needed. And then got the opportunity when Russell left at the last minute before the 2010 football season as a 21-year-old to be on the Redskins beat. And I did that for 4 years, then got the midday show on The Fan, did that for several years, and I'm now on the afternoon drive show. Again, good fortune, great opportunities based on both early on family connections and people that I met along the way. But knowing that that's what I wanted to do, that was my passion. And it was like getting a drink from the water fountain and then being pulled away. Like I got to cover Super Bowls for the Letterman show and ABC's national Super Bowl coverage. Like you want to get back there. You want to do that. And that's the grind.
Yeah. So sports media was your travel ball.
That's right. Yeah. I've never thought of it that way. That's actually hilarious.
I'm aware that, publicly you've talked about kind of anxiety and navigating that. How did anxiety show up in your career as a journalist? I know that can be challenging talking to the folk in front of the mic. Kind of what does that look like for you? And how's that show up?
What I would say, I think every case and situation is very different, right? So my brother within my family was the only person that I had really known as I was growing up that had issues and ultimately was getting any help medication-wise for any kind of mental health things or anxiety and depression, those types of things. what I realized looking back is I had a lack of understanding of what he was going through. And it was never like a massive part of my childhood or our family. Like it was not something that I would consider to have been a big deal, right? But when I bring this up, I just say I had never experienced it. I've heard people talk about the word anxiety or depression or whatever it is come up, and I'm like, okay, sure. I'm sure it's a thing. But like with buddies that would say, yeah, I've got this thing going on. I'm always like it's a choice. Like just choose, be happy, like put a smile on your face, keep one foot in front of the other. And so my journey with it is kind of quick. For some reason I'll never understand. Right around 2016, I was in a career that I loved. I was in a great relationship with my soon-to-be fiance turned wife. Now we got 4 kids. Everything about my life was like going really, really well. I just bought my first home. Like I had the job I wanted. Like everything was awesome. But I did, like out of nowhere, out of the blue, I started to have pretty intense anxiety. And what I would describe it as, to someone who's not familiar, I always say, I felt like I was petrified of heights and I was on the edge of like the Eiffel Tower looking down. That feeling in the pit of your stomach, right? When you're like, oh my God, like this is awful, you know? But it was that all day long, every day, relentlessly for like days on end. Wow. And it came essentially out of nowhere. I have theories as to how it may have happened. You know, I had my appendix taken out not long before that. And like while they were operating and doing whatever, I come to and they're like, hey, do you know about your kidney? And I'm like, no, I have no idea. And they're like, you only have one kidney. And I'm like, what? And I'm like 27 years old and I'm like finding out. Right. And then it turns out with more research, like I actually have a second kidney, but it's atrophic. It's tiny. It's basically non-functioning. Right. It didn't grow from birth or whatever. A lot of people live with one kidney and you know, that's just how they live in perpetuity. And I'd like to have 2, but it's, you know, it's not the end of the world, right? Right. Like at that point, I started to like, you've never my whole life thought about your mortality and at 27 and health stuff. And it just never was a big factor, as you could tell probably by looking at me. And so it just kind of all hit me. And it wasn't long after that I had my first bout of like short term kind of like, oh, what is this? And it was like this anxiety, like what leads to, I didn't have a panic attack per se, but like that kind of feeling. And that was a short term thing. And I kind of think that that's what started it. And then when you first experience that, I think the fear of it happening again is the biggest problem because it's uncontrollable and you don't know where you're going to be or how it's going to materialize. And so I say all this to say that in this 2016 bout that I had, you know, all of the stuff that I would normally use when I was having stressful moments or like you're having a week that's not great or you get bad news, like whatever you lean on. For me, it was like my job or watching sports. I remember watching the Cubs-Guardians World Series in October of that year. And like I am a diehard baseball fan and I couldn't enjoy it, couldn't concentrate on it. It's one of the great World Series in the history. And like it meant nothing to me. And I remember thinking like, I have such a problem right now. It was just kind of like I wasn't there in the moment. But like this was again like a 3 or 4 week stretch of this where and you just start spinning, you know. I remember leaving work sick one day because I was like dry heaving in the bathroom basically at one point. And it was like it was debilitating. Wow. And so I didn't know what was going on. I'd never experienced this. I didn't really know what I knew it was some type of anxiety, but I didn't know what it was. And I just remember talking to my dad on the phone and I was like, I don't know what to do about this. Like this is because you start for people that don't know, it's like your brain goes into like this spiral in a sense where you're like, well, what's causing this? Or like, and then I'm like, well, all right, what if I get fired? I'm like, okay, well then I'll just move here. And then where would I live? Okay, I'll just live here. And then I'll just work at Best Buy. And you're like planning all these things out. And it's like, this is wacky. Like, what am I talking about?
Right.
That was like, what's going on? It was wild. So I finally said, you know, I'm telling my dad all this. And he's like, well, you got to just go talk to a doctor, talk to someone about it and see what they say. And they wanted right away to put me on medicine, on like an antidepressant, like an anxiety medication. And I kind of pushed back on that initially. And I'm like, I don't really want to rely on a pill every day. You know what I'm saying? And I remember this kept going for another couple of weeks. And finally my dad was like, well, if it makes you feel better, what do you care so much? And it was just kind of the idea of like people knowing that I was on a pill, like an antidepressant or something bothered me. But I remember I got on this medicine, a low dose of Paxil, Proxetine. And I have been on that medicine since that day. And he said within a week and a half, it'll start helping you. And within a few days it did. And knock on wood, I have not had much anxiety or any problem. Like you feel it normally, like anybody would.
Right.
Like if I'm about to crash into the car in front of me and I slam my brakes, I get that high up, you're afraid of heights feeling, but like not in perpetuity and not for long stretches and no real, bouts with like a near panic attack. And so I say all this to say I've been lucky. I think people deal with this much more frequently and more elongated than I have. But because I went through that stretch and I know it could happen again at any moment, my empathy for it is real. And what I realized is the reason I brought up my brother, if you've never done it, you just don't get it. Like you can't understand it. There is no controlling this. There is no way to describe it. Like it is lonely. And the reason I've brought it up on the air before is that when it happened to me, I was afraid to tell other people or even talk about it because it sounds like you're crazy, or it sounds like you think no one else has ever experienced this, and it's just not true. So I felt like anytime I could bring it up and just say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm on this medicine, whatever. If one person hears that and they're going through the same thing I went through and it encourages them to reach out to someone or talk to someone or just to say, okay, someone else has done this and is functioning again at a way that works for them, then that's beneficial. So that's kind of my mindset.
I think that's beautiful, and thank you for sharing. It takes kind of vulnerability to really be able to do that. A lot of things people want to hide in the shadows and not talk about, and that's why our company, CLSI, Copious Life Sports Initiative, exists. What we want to do is change the athletic ecosystem, right? And so when you read the research that says the number 2 cause of death for NCAA athletes is suicide, when you see the high-profile cases like the young man in Dallas who took his life, this past season, when you hear all these things, even more recently with Paul George taking medication and then kind of being ostracized from the team and the different things, it's like this system needs to change. You have your Junior Seau, right? So in NFL, you have CTE, but a lot of these athletes struggle at the end of their careers or along the way. And what we want to do is bring and shed light on that, starting with awareness and share these stories and have people be able to tell these stories so that other athletes starting in high school can be like, hey, maybe I can get help. Maybe I can get that. Because suffering and struggling or trying to hide it until you get to the end of your career, it's not going to work, right?
I think normalizing it is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And so undoubtedly your own experience shaped you in being a journalist and being there, talking to the athletes. It's impacted you. And so how did this change how you tell athlete stories, how you engage with athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. What's tough for me is I'm in an industry where we are paid to give opinions all day, every day. Mm-hmm. And I study things. I try to be informed and researched. Oftentimes, I talk to people smarter than me to come up with opinions. And I say this only to say there are often going to be negative opinions. What I try to do, and I probably don't bat 1,000, but I hopefully bat really close to it. I try not to ever make things personal. In other words, I don't, if someone had a bad game, I don't say they're bad. You hear people on the radio or on TV a lot of times be like, oh, that's a bad player, or he stinks. That game was not good, or he did not play well. There's such a difference in that. And I just think the way you talk about people, human beings, does matter. And so, again, I'm sure I've fallen short of this at times, and we're in a business where we're trying to entertain for 4 hours at a time. So it can be tougher than you'd like. But that would be the first thing I would say is I am trying to be very cognizant of talking about how someone plays, not them. I think in general, though, when you've experienced something like this, and I don't know what your background is or if you've dealt with any of these things, but as I said, like with my brother, who helped me so much, I think you're now in this club of like, you get it. Mm-hmm. And so when I hear that this player has dealt with depression or this player has dealt with anxiety, your light bulb is going off to be like, oh my gosh, I know what he went through. That empathy kicks in. Also, when you see or know that players are dealing with things mentally, post-career, whenever, I think it helps you a little bit. Yeah. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I talk to young athletes, I have 3 kids that play travel sports. and I helped to coach my son's team. And after the games, we talk about that car ride home. A lot of these young kids, college kids, probably even some pros, are beating themselves up already. So I'm already beating myself up. Now, if I'm in college and I go online to social media, I'm getting dumped on there too.
Well,
if I flip on the radio or flip on the TV, I'm getting dumped on there too. So I'm already crushing myself. Now this entire system is sitting on my shoulders, crushing me as well.
Yeah, we're in a real rough time in this regard. I mean, the easiest thing to say is to have tough skin.
Right.
And that's true. It's not realistic all the time. It's just not. And by the way, like, not everyone should have to have tough. Like, a kid who's a high school basketball player, who's a junior, like, you're not the president of the United States or an elected senator or, a millionaire actor who someone's going to get on Twitter to say that ruined the movie. You know what I mean? Like, this is a different thing. And so the ask is brutal, I think, sometimes because of social media.
Right.
And it's not just social media, but like the culture, the era that we live in, where
sports gambling, NIL, right?
Yes.
All that stuff. And college kids hearing, I bet all this money and lost it because you couldn't make that last shot. Dude, I'm trying to take my final exams.
Right.
What are we doing
No,
here?
it's bad. It's and I don't have a fix. I wish I did. I think with something like that, like the tough thing is, my initial response would be, well, like, gambling on college sports could be different than professional sports in the sense of, I don't know that we need it, but in no way is college not professional in any other capacity at this juncture either. So I don't know if you can take one away without all the others and have your cake and eat it too. But I do think the player prop element in college is unnecessary in a big way for me. Here in Virginia, where I'm based, you can't bet on individual player props for college. And I've always thought that was smarter than most states do it, because they're not professionals. I mean, as much as now it's becoming that, and I understand that argument from people, these are still, amateurs, even if it doesn't seem like it. But it's a scary time in that regard. And, the stuff I don't like is the very personal stuff, the really angry stuff. It's just so unnecessary, but it's so normal on social media now. It's really a shame.
It's unfortunate. And so, Grant, you sit adjacent to or directly inside of this athlete ecosystem: locker rooms, press conferences, practice facilities, breaking news moments, crisis situations. What have you seen, learned, or witnessed about how mental health shows up for athletes behind the scenes? I think from a professional perspective, as a clinician, one of those ways that could show up is times where kind of pressure overwhelmed performance. And so have you seen behind the scenes an athlete that's slowly crumbling from that pressure to perform? They got to go out and have a good game because it's a contract year, or they're struggling to meet that expectation. I think of some of the young wideouts for the Redskins Commanders back in the day that were drafted and had those expectations and just couldn't perform. So have you seen some of that kind of fracturing?
You do wonder how many times when you just assumed that a guy wasn't good enough, that they were drafted and just couldn't cut it. Was it not that at all? Right. Was it the mental part of it where they were either early on overwhelmed and drinking through a fire hose and couldn't catch up, or they were just having real legitimate issues that in a different era and a different time, they would have felt comfortable getting ironed out and worked out. I mean, you see now that the money that teams spend, and I don't know that all of them are doing what they need to do, but I think most of them are getting there, with sports psychologists. Mental health is taken as seriously by a lot of teams as physical health, and it should be. But like, there's so many variables to this, and people smarter than me can speak better to this. But like, teams now, sleep doctors dictate when you're traveling and when you're not, right?
Right.
You finish your game tonight. You got a game 2 days from now in LA. When are we flying, Capitals? And it used to be different than now. Major League Baseball at the Nationals, similarly, very different than now. I think it all there's an amount of money and resources being spent to help the players. And I think, you just think about it, if there was no sports psychologist on your staff, if there wasn't someone to talk to, if you didn't know about other players on your team that were doing this, are you going to put the work in to be, to break these barriers? And now I think the teams are making it easier for the players. I think that's a big deal. I think that's significant.
Right. Yeah, no, I think, that's part of the ecosystem that has shifted and changing. Obviously, some organizations do that better than other organizations. Some sports do that better than other sports.
You've always had, as long as I can remember, I'm giving you benefits, health insurance. We're taking care of the physical stuff. Mental was viewed differently. It really shouldn't be. I mean, it's very
Right.
comparable.
Right. I mean, and then you talk about, specifically with the NFL kind of getting to the end of your career and some of that support stops. And that's when that identity is crashing, right? I've been this guy since I was 8 years old. I have been a football player or I've been a basketball player all this time. And now I'm at the end of my careers and I'm 30 or 40 and I have no clue who I am outside of that. And what we talk about is, we have to start calling that what that is. That's grief. If there was a side of you that you knew for 20, 30, 40 years,
Yeah.
that's done. You can't go back to it. Jordan's not getting back out in the NBA and being able to do any of what he was doing before. How do you grieve that? How do you deal with that? And then you're now not just grieving, you have to figure out who you are. You have to go home to your family that you have. You have to figure out what I'm doing for it. Like, you figure that out. And sure, you should figure that out along the way, but that's a real crisis point for a lot of athletes. And it might not wait till the end of the career. It might come when an injury comes. That first big injury comes. What do I do? How do I sit still with this?
And there's no one that can, until you experienced it, there's no like manual on how to deal with that. Because everyone's going to have to cope differently and find a way to get where they need to go differently. I also think that's somewhat relatable for people even who don't play sports, because in varying degrees we deal with that where you've been going to school every day of your life and all of a sudden you graduate high school and they're like, all right, what now? You get out of college and for 4 years you've been in this routine, and that grief is a good word potentially, but it's like, okay, what now?
Right.
For me, I think about this a lot, in this changing industry. But this is all I've ever known, as we talked about. I mean, from when I'm 10 years old to now, it's all I've ever wanted to do. So if the roller coaster ends tomorrow, I don't know what you pivot to. So much of my self-worth in an unhealthy way is tied up into this, into like doing a good job on the air or trying to put together a good show or getting information and news before other people have it to break a story or whatever that is. Like, that's not who I am. That's what I do. But when it's your job, and in my case especially, it has been what I've done since I was 10. And in those formative years, you're doing that and getting some notoriety for it, and it's just tied to you in a way, linked and inextricably. Where like if this ended, it would take a lot of work for me to not have issues with that. So I can totally understand where players come from in that regard.
Right. Yeah. And I think coaches experience that when they lose a job. Separate a man from his job and you'll see somebody that's really struggling for a little bit to figure out kind of what, especially if you have a family. And I think, part of what we see, I know you guys had a segment last week talking about youth sports. Part of what we see and what these parents are showing up with is they never grieve their careers. They never grieve giving up that I'm no longer an athlete. So now I have my kid. I'm living vicariously through them. And I'm yelling at the referees and coaches because I don't have the controller in my hand to make my kid do what he needs to do. And now I'm mad at everybody else and I'm reliving it through that. And so that's some of the ways it shows up is we don't take care of, especially with athletics, when that comes to an end. And it just kind of sits dormant until something scratches that itch open again sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's well said. There's got to be a way to close the chapter in a healthy way. And I think if you don't deal with that, as you said, with those parents, that's going to show up. But, there's not a good way to close a chapter when you didn't want it to close necessarily.
The narratives shape kind of that athlete identity. And you talked a little bit about ethical framing of a bad game, right? Versus you're terrible, right? And the importance of that, the responsibility of storytelling and media, right? You can tell a story in 1,000 different ways. And all of those stories can be written and all of those segments can be done bashing a guy who's really struggling with something dark and deep that he can't get over.
It's a great point. And we've done a lot of those segments. This is something I do struggle with. And so I talk about the empathy, and I am uncomfortable. I don't have a background in this, so I don't like the idea of like diagnosing, right? I also think there are times where, and I have no idea, this is just my own personal opinion, where sometimes people are just not acting right. And I have a frustration with the lack of decorum and the lack of expectations of what is reasonable in society right now. And I think it's just getting so watered down that it's unacceptable. So I have a hard time with just going, oh, he's probably dealing with something, and just kind of moving on, where that might be the best way to do it. But it's tough for me. That's the one thing I do struggle with when you talk about the media and the intersection of the struggling athlete is like, I think there's still got to be an expectation in some way of what is an acceptable way to operate and act and how to treat people. And maybe there's a happy medium of like empathy versus the you got to be kidding me. You're, Dum Dum of the Day segment that my buddy Chris Russell does. Or, we don't call it that, but we do it, right? And, do I feel bad about some of that content and some of those segments? I do, because as you said, this is a human being. But I would ask you, I mean, what do you think? Like, to me, a lot of that is brought on yourself, and there's got to be some expectation in society of like you kind of opting into this with the rest of us to act reasonably.
I agree that there's a responsibility for actions. What I would say is, and I'll kind of kick it back to you, Grant in 2016 being met with the need for medication to deal with anxiety. If that Grant hadn't made the decision to do that, what would today's Grant look like, right? What would it look like for you? And so I think, and especially with, if we talk about bipolar disorder, a lot of folks that are dealing with that high, that mania is hard to walk away from. When you're used to going 1,000 miles per hour and you slow down to 20, it can feel terrifying.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of folks that are struggling with the idea of taking medication for that, because this feeling is next level. And I'm not just going down to a baseline, right? I'm going down to something that feels like I've almost come to a complete crawl. So I want to get back to that. And so I think that's where I have empathy. You kind of told your story. Well, my father struggled with bipolar disorder growing up. Right. And so I've seen that up close and personal. And so I can see it. I can smell it a mile away when it shows up. When I see an athlete with it or a musical artist or something, I can see it from a mile away. My empathy is, I understand what that is, what it looks like, and why it's tough for them to want to get on medication. However, there's still the responsibility because of the families they have, the lives they impact, and everything else. But it's a toss-up because it's a real pervasive mental health issue, and it's not just going to go away. And so how much empathy would I have for somebody that's struggling with cancer for years, a real thing, in the same way that mental health issue is a real thing? And it's because we can't see it, smell it, taste it.
Right.
It's because we can only see the signs and symptoms of it that we're able to stigmatize it and keep it stigmatized, which keeps it in the dark, which makes it so that the next person isn't going to go get the help they need. Because I don't want to be treated or ostracized like this. I want to try and keep it to myself. And so I think what we're actually talking about is the stigma around the mental health issue that leads to people not wanting to treat it, not wanting to have the conversations, which makes it all that more important that we have these conversations and more conversations like that. Because I think if you remove that stigma, more people will be willing to get help. More people will be willing to identify and have the conversations. And so one of the things that we're working towards is athlete kind of mental health and performance camps over the summer, right? Everybody wants their kids to be working out. So come on, get your strength, conditioning, speed, agility, mobility all in there. And each day, let's go through a different topic on mental health. And if we get 20, 30, 40 kids in camps, if we get multiple kids in camps, it may not be important for each of those kids that they're going to have a mental health issue. But that's one more kid in an army of kids in a locker room. So if I see my teammate with it, I say, hey, he might need some help. If two of us have been there, we might be able to have a conversation with it, removing the stigma and making it something more relatable. And I think for me, that's the story of, let's say, an Antonio Brown. because that's a symptom of the fact that we don't deal with this differently along the way. Antonio Brown didn't just show up at the end of his time with the Steelers with that issue. That was probably there in college, and it might have been there in high school, and the system didn't deal with it. Then you threw money on top of it,
Right.
and elite performance and eyes and media attention on top of it, right? Then you have this. So I can't be mad at the symptom of an athlete ecosystem that was never built to deal with mental health. It just wants to perform.
It's well said. I mean, it's eloquently and beautifully said. And I think that what you're doing when you're talking about young people and raising the awareness is a game changer. And I just think all of the awareness, that's the word I would use, that we can use to shed a light on mental health being as important as the physical, but also just the willingness to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to ask for the help. It's going to do wonders. So like those kids will eventually be the post NFL player and will have a different understanding and a better way to use those resources. So I think what you're doing is really, really impressive.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, Grant, I really appreciate your time. And I think there's going to be people that recognize your face and your voice. And for you to be able to, be vulnerable and talk about your own anxiety, we want to help save these kids' lives.
I don't know how old you are. I'm like 37. I feel like if you're older than me, you really didn't grow up in a time where there was an awareness. And I'm generalizing, but that's my experience. I think people my age-ish are the first people where it's a little bit more okay. I do think that the younger people today are growing up in a more understanding, empathetic, accepting environment where these conversations happen. Like I remember I mentioned calling my dad and he's like, you don't want to take medicine. Why? What's the worst thing that can happen, right? I remember being fearful of even calling and telling him that, thinking he would be like, you don't need medicine,
right?
Like thinking he wouldn't understand. And that's not how he thought at all. But I do think there are plenty of people in his generation, his age, that would say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
and like I said, you got the story of just yesterday, and I don't know what's true and false and what the facts are and everything else, but Paul George saying, hey, I took medication for mental health.
Right.
I popped 30 and now I'm suspended. Like that is going to put a number of other athletes back in the box.
I thought about that too. I'm going to take him at his word. Like I have no reason not to trust him and give him the benefit of the doubt. But to your point, my first thought when I saw that is, oh, this is awful. Because I think if I am a player that's either considering taking something or is taking something, do you stop taking it? Like that was my initial thought on that story. Man, I mean, we're trying to get people like, hey, it's okay. You can take the medicine and talk to the person and have the conversations. Man, that would be rough if now you can second.
I'm back in the box and I need you to put duct tape over it and a couple books.
I don't.
Not of this thing.
You know how these players think. They don't want to have to deal with that. So that's worrisome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you, Grant.
Before we conclude today's episode, some takeaways. Athletes, media coverage does not tell your whole story. Your identity is bigger than headlines and statistics. Public pressure is real. Learning how to manage outside opinions is a critical mental skill. You deserve to be seen as a person, not just a performer. Parents, athletes today grow up under constant visibility. Social media and media coverage amplify pressure early. Help athletes build resilience against outside opinions and online criticism. Teach athletes that their value is not determined by public perception. Coaches, the sports ecosystem includes fans and media. Prepare athletes for the mental pressure of visibility. Coaches can help shift culture by humanizing athletes and modeling empathy. One of the most important moments in today's conversation was Grant sharing his hesitation around medication after being diagnosed with anxiety. And that hesitation is incredibly common. According to the American Psychological Association, more than 40% of people say they feel uncomfortable with the idea of taking medication for mental health. Nearly half of young adults say they would rather try to handle it alone first. And athletes are even less likely to seek treatment because of the pressure to appear strong and self-sufficient. There is still a quiet belief in sports and in our culture that needing medication means something is wrong with you. But the truth is much simpler. Medication is not a weakness. It's not a shortcut. It's not a failure. For many people, it's a tool. Just like physical therapy after injury, just like wearing glasses when your vision changes, just like rehabbing a torn ligament so your body can function the way it was designed to. Some people need therapy. Some people need lifestyle changes. Some people need medication. Many people need a combination. And none of those paths makes someone less strong. If anything, choosing to get help is one of the strongest decisions a person can make. If today's conversation helps even one listener feel less hesitant to talk to a professional, ask questions, or explore treatment options, then we are moving the culture forward. This is how stigma fades, one honest conversation at a time. We will see you next time on Beyond the Game, where mental wellness competes. Make sure to follow CLSI on Instagram and TikTok at clsi.life. Share this episode. Engage with the movement. Together, we can close the resilience gap.